Welcome to another interview. I am Pascal from the Neutrality Studies Network, and in collaboration with the Austrian magazine International, link below, I'm talking today to Dr. Anatol Lieven, who is a British author, policy analyst, former professor at Georgetown University, and currently a senior research fellow at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. Dr. Lieven is intimately familiar with Eastern Europe and Central Asia. From 1985 to 1998, he worked as a journalist in the region, covering the wars in Afghanistan, in Chechnya, and the southern Caucasus. He is the author of several books on Russia and its neighbors, including the Baltic Revolutions, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and the Path to Independence, and more recently, Ukraine and Russia, a fraternal rivalry. Dr. Lieven wrote several other important books, but today we are here to discuss the situation in and around Ukraine, about which he has published by now several pieces and been quite outspoken. He wrote an essay in defense of Ambassador Jack Matlock, who we had on this channel before, arguing that it's first and foremost Ukraine that had to come to terms with its own diversity, and that the conflict with Russia is heavily impacted by the Ukrainian government's failing to find a workable deal for its own minorities. He also recently published an article in Foreign Policy in which he argued for security cooperation among NATO and Russia. Dr. Lieven, I want to talk to you about all of this today, so thank you for taking the time.
Hello.
Before we get into the nitty-gritty of Ukraine and Russia, let me ask you a warm-up question about your current employer, because a lot of our viewership is in Europe and probably not that familiar with the Quincy Institute. What exactly is the Quincy Institute? How does it compare to working there instead of a university? And does the Quincy Institute have any stance on what's currently going on, or are views among your colleagues fairly mixed of what's happening between Ukraine and Russia?
The Quincy Institute really grew originally out of opposition to the Iraq War in 2003. I think that was when many of us first came together, and came together, by the way, from both the left and the right. So the Quincy is internally a coalition of, not extreme conservatives, but moderate conservatives and moderate leftists. But we all have one thing in common, which is that we oppose the search for American primacy in the world by military means. We believe in cooperation rather than rivalry between the great powers. And we oppose the militarization of American policy. And from that point of view, we, unlike some of the other think tanks, we do have you could say, an ideological goal, and we're all on the same side about this, though we differ fairly considerably about domestic politics, although actually not entirely, because the Quincy is, for example, also very much opposed to the militarization of the American police. So while we certainly wouldn't support slogans like defund the police or abolish the police, we strongly criticize the heavily armed and trigger happy and paramilitary aspect of the American police today, for I suppose obvious reasons, right? And the Quincy only got started, however, a couple of years ago, basically because it took the intervening period of 16 years from the Iraq War to put together donors. The donors are also, in terms of domestic politics, a very mixed bunch, but have also come together in opposition to American military dominance and primacy in the world. And of course, our support and our own attitudes have been heavily influenced by the repeated failures of this policy over the past 20 years. Obviously, the disaster of the Iraq War, the failure in Afghanistan, the disastrous intervention in Libya, Syria, which only narrowly avoided becoming another American disaster thanks to Barack Obama. And the Quincy, certainly does not support the ambitions of either Russia or Iran or China, but equally does not believe that America can simply disregard the interests of these countries and attempt to impose its will on them by either military or economic intimidation. In other words, the Quincy does also have a realist attitude to it. We believe that there are great states in the world, that the interests of these states are not determined by their political systems. In other words, even, well, as was, by the way, true, I mean, a much more liberal and democratic Russian government in the 1990s was also categorically opposed to NATO enlargement. And members of that government and its supporters, told us at the time that if NATO membership were extended, or there was a threat to extend it to Ukraine and Georgia, that this would mean deep confrontation and quite possibly war. So that is the profile of the Quincy.
You're a British author and scholar, right? So the Quincy does have like international connections, or can you say like where it's centered in the US in Washington D.C., but it has members also from Europe working there, right?
To some extent. I mean, I think I'm the European branch of the Quincy at present. My office is behind me. Can't see the bed at the moment. But certainly the Quincy looks for alliances and support with people all over the world, really, but certainly in Europe, who also do not believe in attempts at the further expansion of Western power. I suppose, though from a slightly different angle, both the conservatives and the liberals among us both believe that America and the West should concentrate on urgent domestic reform, rather than the attempts at, if you like, global domination. And as far as Europe is concerned, we strongly support the European Union and the role of the European Union in Eastern Europe. But I think it's fair to say that, like many people, we've become skeptical about the possibility of the further enlargement of the European Union, and also the chances of turning the European Union into some, European super state. So
we're not getting to Ukraine and Russia, but I have just one more question on my mind now. That's there's this interesting tension in Europe of some people who say Europe should have its own military capabilities different from NATO, but the transatlantic network is quite opposed to that because it would weaken NATO. At Quincy, are you equally conflicted, or do you have a view of whether Europe should have its own military?
Well, we certainly think that Europe should do much more to deal with its own security, partly because, given the tremendous unpopularity in the American public of American, more American commitments, especially in Europe, where, after all, so many in America point out, Europe is quite rich enough and strong enough, to account for its own defense. I myself, I actually have an essay coming out in Politique étrangère in April, saying that the European Union needs to define its military role, and European countries do, in terms of threats to Europe, which Europe both can, does have the physical capacity to meet, and should have the will to meet. And I talk about the Balkans, where only frankly, a tiny number of Western troops and the threat of American intervention are preventing new wars in Kosovo and Bosnia, and where, of course, Europe failed so shamefully in the early 1990s. And then I talk about Western Africa, where so much of the recent news has indicated the French effort there is faltering. The Europeans have done very little in concrete terms to help, and yet this is an area where a combination of government dysfunction, population growth, deep poverty, corruption, of course, Islamist extremism, and the growing threat of climate change, risk state collapse with really, really serious consequences for Europe, above all in terms of migration. So so this is something that these are things that Europe should be able to do. I have to say, though, that I have become very skeptical about whether Europe actually will do this. And well, we could talk about this in the context of Ukraine, but I find the European behavior in recent weeks to have been, frankly, for a European, as I still consider myself, humiliating.
Let's go there. I mean, I've only given a very brief introduction of you, but your relationship with Ukraine and Eastern Europe, Central Asia is quite deep. Can you tell us a little bit more, especially about Ukraine, what your engagement over the past decade or 2 decades has been with the country?
Well, my engagement in Ukraine goes back almost 3 decades, because as a correspondent for the London Times in the former Soviet Union and then based in Moscow, I traveled to Ukraine very frequently. And I wrote a book which came out in 1999 that you mentioned, Ukraine and Russia, a Fraternal Rivalry, based on my travels in Ukraine. And the thesis I set forward in that book is that Ukraine is a deeply divided country with very different versions of its national identity. And to a lesser extent, different versions of its geopolitical alignment. And I said in the book, which came out 23 years ago now, that any attempt to rigidly define Ukraine one way or the other, either in terms of defining its internal identity or trying to force Ukraine to a choice between the West and Russia, would lead to disaster and, of course, Russian intervention. So my line has always been that Ukraine, by its very nature, is a country which needs to be left alone to find its own way. By the way, I blame the Russian government very much in 2013 for attempting to bring Ukraine into the Eurasian Union, because I was always convinced that that would set off, colossal protests and rebellion within Ukraine, which of course it did. But I also warned that any attempt to bring Ukraine into NATO, well, I've always said that membership of the European Union is so far away for Ukraine that it can almost be shelved for another generation, because it depends on internal reforms which are faltering. But I've argued for 25 years that any attempt to bring Ukraine into NATO would lead both to revolt in some of the Russian areas of the country and to Russian intervention, which of course also happened.
2 questions about this. On the one hand, what do you make out of this current media onslaught about Ukraine should the door should be open for Ukraine to join NATO, when it's pretty much clear to anyone who knows how NATO functions and what the current distribution of opinions is within NATO that this is purely hypothetical, while on the other hand Russia is demanding security guarantees and a talk actually about this common European security. That's one. The other one is, what do you make out? You made this point in an article that you wrote in defense of Ambassador Jack Matlock, saying that there are currently tendencies, nationalistic tendencies and worrisome tendencies inside Ukraine that label anything that does not agree with Ukraine being a more or less unitary society as outsiders and something that they want to eradicate. Do you see this still boiling, or can you explain this, flesh this out a bit more?
Well, to give one example, the Minsk II process, agreement of 2015, aimed at bringing peace to the Donbass, includes a proviso that the linguistic, which means Russian, rights and cultural autonomy of Russians within Ukraine should be fully respected. Well, there have been a whole row of laws over the past 3 years which have flatly contradicted that, and which, by the way, were actually condemned by the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, though only because the Hungarians, who also have a minority in Ukraine, protested against this. And I mean, obviously, the present Ukrainian position on the Donbass, that the Donbass must return to a unitary Ukraine without local autonomy, and in circumstances where the Ukrainian central government and parliament can continue to act, to attempt over time to abolish the Russian language within Ukraine. I mean, it's completely unacceptable in itself. It certainly will never be acceptable to the people of the Donbass, but also, of course, it totally contradicts Western principles, that we have pursued with regard to other ethnically divided societies.
But what we hear in the West is that the Donbass, these two wannabe republics, are puppets of Russia, and the only reason why they are alive is basically because of Russia supports them militarily. And if it wasn't for Russia, then the Donbass would be basically a peaceful part of Ukraine, and it would be all united. What do you make out of that?
But that's nonsense. I mean, I traveled extensively in the Donbass. If you look at all the opinion polls before 2014, since 2014, of course, it's not easy to trust opinion polls on either side, of the lines. But there was, overwhelming support for local autonomy, and of course for official status for the Russian language in Ukraine. Not, of course, Russian as the official language of Ukraine. No, that has to be Ukrainian. But that language, that the Russian language should be protected. So no, I mean, of course, Russian troops, very likely disguised, are fighting in the Donbass. But undoubtedly, the rebellion of 2014 also had serious local support, as, by the way, of course, did the Russian intervention in Crimea, had local support there.
I wanted to ask you about that. Do you think that if this that referendum in Crimea in 2014 was done under very, very suspicious circumstances, and really Russia doesn't look very good in it? It's really easy to say, like, look, this is all made up. But according to your personal opinion, if this was done according to the book, with international supervision and so on and so forth, and with the agreement of all parties, would there still have been a majority of Crimeans to say, like, yes, we want to join Russia?
Oh, in my opinion, yes, undoubtedly. By the way, I mean, the idea has been advanced by Tom Graham, former US diplomat, and others, that we really need to try to solve all the present territorial disputes in Europe on the common basis of local democracy. In other words, actually go to the local people with an internationally supervised, United Nations supervised referenda, and see what they think. Incidentally, on this score, you said that all these places are Russian puppets, and you hear that as well about Abkhazia and South Ossetia, where, by the way, it's also totally untrue. The Abkhaz population is completely united, the ethnic Abkhaz, but also the Russian and Armenians there were absolutely united in support of independence from Georgia. It's so interesting that nobody talks about Nagorno-Karabakh as simply a Russian puppet, although the Russian peacekeepers went in there as well to save what was left.
Or Moldova.
Or Moldova, but I'm thinking particularly of Nagorno-Karabakh, which could also be portrayed, and sometimes in the West was portrayed as, Russia stepping in to extend its empire. We didn't hear nearly so much, of course, about Nagorno-Karabakh and the illegitimacy of it and so forth in this context. That, I fear, had absolutely nothing to do with Western standards of legality or democracy, common standards. It had everything, of course, to do with the Armenian diaspora in France and America. When I was a journalist there, it was astonishing, the difference between Western journalists' sympathy for the Armenians and, automatic dismissal of the Abkhaz and the Ossets as simply puppets of Russia. And that was to do, basically with ethnic affinity.
I think we can agree that if the principle of local self-determination was actually taken serious in Europe and Western Europe as well, well, we would have a completely different map, including Catalonia, including the Basque Country, probably Scotland, and the Kosovo. Well, the Kosovo will stay as it is, and certainly in Israel, we would have a big change with the local population of the Palestinians.
Well, I'm not that optimistic, much as I would love to see a democratic solution to the Israel-Palestinian dispute. Alas, I don't see that coming anytime soon. But the main thing in realist terms is that on the basis of common standards, we basically offer Russia a deal, saying, look, Serbia is not going to reconquer Kosovo, or if it does, it will lead to another massive crisis, with the West, and cannot reconquer Kosovo without colossal ethnic cleansing. On the other hand, of course, Mitrovica, the Serbian area of Kosovo, has to return to Serbia. There's no question about it. You accept a democratic solution there, and we will accept a democratic solution for Crimea, Abkhazia, Ossetia, and the Donbass. My own view is that you would see a large majority in the Donbass for guaranteed autonomy within Ukraine, but it has to be, completely guaranteed and cast iron. Incidentally, once again, it's very difficult to say what opinions are now, because that there's been considerable, action within Ukraine, or Ukraine proper, or what's left of Ukraine, or call it what you will, to suppress pro-Russian parties and politicians. But certainly when I was traveling there previously, there was very strong support throughout the east and south of the country for the idea of a federal Ukraine, in which regions would have rights, comparable, say, to those of the German Länder. In other words, considerable control over local affairs, including language. So the line of the Western media that this is a struggle of democracy against authoritarianism is, to put it mildly, only part of the story.
How come that this solution didn't emerge over the last 30 years, a federal Ukraine? I mean, there have been considerable pushes for it, and not at least also from the outside. I mean, the Minsk I, Minsk II, and so on. They prescribed federalization and local autonomy, and it wasn't implemented. Why?
You see this throughout the post-colonial world. The anti-colonial governments that succeeded the French and the British took over French and British means of government, highly centralized, highly authoritarian, police-based. And of course, one also has to sympathize with this, because in a new state where you're very afraid of it disintegrating, naturally, the tendency is to centralize, keep authority, at the center. But the problem is, in the case of Ukraine, this has now become mixed up to a limited extent before 2014, but much more since then. With this program of ethnic nationalism, of ethnic Ukrainianization, moves to abolish the Russian language within Ukraine. By the way, I mean, the Ukrainian state is so weak, and so much of the Ukrainian population speaks Russian, that so far, in practical terms, these have not gone very far. But the long-term implications are obvious. This, by the way, was one reason why, after 6 years of basically, watching Ukraine and supporting the Donbass, but not putting greatly increased pressure on Ukraine. Last year, Russia, really vastly increased its pressure to the present point where you do have large numbers of Russian troops deployed on the border, because Moscow had always reckoned that in the long run, the Ukrainian people were going to realize they weren't going to get into NATO, they weren't going to get into the European Union, and so why not do, not rejoin the Soviet Union, or but do a reasonable deal with Russia. But the confidence in this was also founded in the belief, which Putin said in an essay last year, about the close cultural ties of not all the Ukrainian people, of course, not those in Western Ukraine, but of many Ukrainians and Russians, founded on language, on intermarriage, on common history, all these things. But of course, when Moscow began to think that if sustained over a generation, Ukrainian policies were actually going to destroy the cultural basis for this, that was one reason why they decided that now they must put their foot down.
Why is it that that we're not escaping this narrative of Russia as the enemy over there, when to anyone with a reasonable sense of European history understands that there has always been tension and always been a back and forth, and Russia is fairly and squarely a part of Europe? Why is it that Gorbachev's vision of a common European home could not be realized? And do you see a way forward with this crisis, or out of this crisis, into a common European security structure, which Russia actually demands, and which reminds me very much of what the Soviet Union did and finally led to the CSCE, right? That was a Soviet idea implemented through the neutrals and then commonly negotiated, and that became a European solution to a European problem. So do you have thoughts on this?
Well, in the 1990s, Russia became so weak that frankly, the West decided that it didn't matter, that it could do anything, and Russia's objections didn't count. Now, of course, that was always, in part, it was always a mistake, because, as I have often said, real geopolitical power in the world is not absolute, it's local and relative. In other words, it is the power that one country is willing and able to bring to bear on a particular issue or in a particular place, relative to what another power is able but also willing to bring to bear. And you see that in so many cases. Nobody could conceivably fantasize that in absolute terms Pakistan and America are equals, or that Pakistan is superior to America. But it turns out that in southern and eastern Afghanistan, Pakistan is more powerful than America, because Pakistan is there. It's there. It has a deep stake in that society. It's always going to be there on Afghanistan's borders. It has a tremendous economic hold over Afghanistan, but also, as we've seen, Pakistan has been willing to run immense risks, colossal risks, for the sake of what it regards as its vital interests in Afghanistan. Well, it's no different with Russia. As Russia, even in the 1990s, Russia had more real power on the ground in parts of Ukraine and in the Caucasus than the West did. And in the end, that also comes down, speaking as a realist, to the oldest and clearest test of all of a country's vital interests, which is that they are interests for which a country is in the last resort prepared to fight. Now, Russia has demonstrated that in the last resort, it is prepared to fight for its vital interests in the former Soviet Union. And we have, in recent weeks, stated absolutely clearly, categorically, openly, that we are not prepared to fight. We are not prepared to send troops to defend Ukraine. And so, ultimately, that means that Russia is in a superior position. Now, I don't think that means that Russia has actually decided to invade Ukraine. But the point is that if it does, NATO will not go to war.
But the West has been emphasizing so much that it's shoring up its troops on the NATO territory and sending British troops to Poland, and all the talk about the Baltic states being afraid and like shoring up their security and their preparedness. So there seems to be this kind of confusion of what an attack on Ukraine would mean for NATO, because even if actually tanks from Russia were rolling all the way to Kiev, that would still not imply any attack on NATO territory, would it?
No, it wouldn't. And frankly, if it did, which it doesn't, but I mean, if the Russians had a serious intention of attacking these countries, then the number of troops that we have sent to defend them would be pathetically inadequate. You know, if you look at the numbers, Britain has sent 1 battalion. Denmark has sent 2 planes. Holland has sent 1 frigate. America has sent 8,500 troops. Well, no, actually, it hasn't. It said it would. I think it sent 5,000 so far. That would not stop the Russian army. But the point is that Russia has no intention of attacking these places. So there is an element of pure theatricality, about NATO's response. And in a way, I mean, that's why this whole crisis suits our traditional security elite so well, because it is the Cold War scenario in Europe, not of course the Cold War scenario in Africa or Southeast Asia, but we parade our steadfastness, against the Eastern threat, but in the deep conviction that actually we will never have to fight. This is an ideal confrontation from NATO's point of view, because NATO is not an alliance that is configured to fight. It's a security alliance, but not a fighting alliance. Whenever it's tried to fight since the end of the Cold War, the results have been either that America has taken over and pushed NATO out of the way, as in Kosovo and Libya, or, of course, that the NATO contribution has turned into a pathetic failure, as in Afghanistan. So yes, I mean, there's this is to some extent a theatrical performance.
So what's in your opinion, what's more important in this entire crisis, deterring Russia or indoctrinating the people who make up the NATO alliance? Because a lot of what we hear also from Washington is clearly geared towards local consumption, right?
Mm. Well, I mean, various great interests go into, maintaining NATO and the idea of NATO, as this essential force. First of all, as you well know, it is the terror of the Europeans at being left on their own. A total, which was so much reinforced by the failure in Bosnia, in the early 90s. But a deep and probably correct conviction that Europe, is unwilling to do the things necessary to maintain its own security. Although actually, of course, the best thing it could do would be to make a deal with Russia, in which case there would be no threat to NATO security from the east. But even if you talk to more honest European officials in private, they will say it's not. Some of them will even say it's not about Russia at all. Some will say it's not only about Russia. It's also that if a new war broke out in the Balkans and the Americans did not intervene, Europe would fail again, miserably, to contain this. And then, of course, there's a specific thing in the case of France, which is that France has become more and more dependent on the United States to maintain France's sphere of influence in Western Africa against the rise of Islamism. Without, given that European support has been pathetic there, without American support, France could not sustain that campaign. Well, it's failing already. So there is the European, belief that America has to remain in Europe, and NATO is the, is the source of this commitment. There is the American, of course, belief that that NATO is the best possible vehicle and base for American geopolitical power in the western parts of Eurasia and the Middle East. Because, of course, America dominates NATO. NATO, in the last resort, will do what America says. Very occasionally, France and Germany, in extreme cases, will push back against this, but not often. And, of course, NATO is airstrip one. I mean, the American bases in Europe are critical for the power projection of America, in the Middle East in particular, and Northern Africa. Now, of course, you could do this in terms of bilateral agreements with European countries, but that would, NATO creates this pretty thin impression, of an alliance of equals, which of course is an unbelievable joke, but still. Whereas, of course, if Italy and Germany and Britain simply had American bases, that would look much more like a neo-colonial, or quasi-imperial relationship of dependency. And then, of course, within Europe, there are the interests of the NATO security elites and their branches, in effect, in every country, and the huge media influence that these have. The willingness of Western journalists, alas, to reprint without criticism whatever is said. And as I say, the great thing from the point of view of German soldiers, officers, Danes, everyone else, is that NATO guarantees employment, and of course NATO itself, the NATO staff, is a colossal provider of jobs for military bureaucrats. But it's an alliance that does not and will not fight. So what could be better from the point of view of a soldier who doesn't really want to fight anyway?
So you were a journalist, and as a journalist, seeing how journalism right now is working on this topic, what are your thoughts there? I mean, have you been approached by large media for interviews, or have you seen a lot of this viewpoint in the public sphere of the big news media?
A little. I mean,
why?
Well, where to begin? Firstly, lack of history. I mean, to understand Russia's position, I just wrote an essay for the British magazine Prospect, pointing out the similarities between the post-imperial experience of the countries of the former Soviet Union and those of the French and British and other empires, which leave, of course, endless territorial disputes and conflicts behind, or the Ottoman Empire for that matter. But of course, most journalists are not historians and never, they don't have the time. I was unusual as a journalist, who'd been previously trained as a historian. And therefore, you have a tendency to accept simple narratives. Then, of course, there is the Cold War anti-Russian narrative, which various journals and interests, assiduously tried to keep going, ever since the fall of the Soviet Union. Every Russian complaint, whether justified or unjustified, about the disenfranchisement of Russian speakers in the Baltic states, for example, the Chechen War, these little territorial disputes in the Caucasus, comparable really to minor territorial squabbles, in Africa or whatever. Every one of them was blown up by sections of the Western media, from 1991 on, as an attempt to restore the Soviet Union, and that this was right, right. And you read this: expansion, imperialism is in the Russian DNA. An attempt to reconstruct the Soviet Union is inevitable. Blah blah blah. And a lot of journalists, bought that throughout and continue to buy it. And then, there is the fact that, and, let's make no bones about it, the Putin regime is in many ways a very nasty one and has done a lot of nasty things, both internally, but also with extreme stupidity, brutality, and incompetence, has also gone out to murder its opponents abroad, in Western Europe. Which obviously, is an offence against our sovereignty and international law. Now, of course, the Russians reply, well, but we turn a blind eye to Saudi Arabia doing this, and America uses, we use assassination. I mean, it's in public, of course, but we use assassinations. America uses drone attacks. Well, okay, but I mean, A, do you really want to look like Mohammed bin Salman? And B, this is Europe. To be blunt, we are willing in Europe to tolerate nasty things elsewhere in the world that, for very good reasons, we have many more problems with when it's on our on our territory. So, I mean, obviously, the Putin regime has become, seriously unpopular with many Western liberals who, in other circumstances, might be inclined to take a much, calmer and more restrained view of this. But in America, the disastrous thing was the combination of Trump and what in the end were very, very limited Russian attempts to influence the elections of 2016. All the attempts by American investigators to show a crucial Russian role, either in manipulating the elections or in manipulating Trump, have basically failed. Whereas on the other hand, the Hillary Clinton's team's attempt to manufacture evidence to show Trump as a Russian agent, they are out there in plain sight, but the media ignores them. But you see, so the supporters of the Democratic Party in America, on the basis of this, became pathologically anti-Russian from 2016 on. But you see, underlying this is the fact that, and you sometimes see this in Europe as well, they cannot bear to admit two things. One is that not a majority, of course, but very nearly 50% of the American people in 2016 and 47% of the American people in 2020 did vote for Trump. The Democrats won the popular vote, but not by much. This is, American liberals simply cannot bear to admit that their own country, is so genuinely divided, and that so many of their fellow citizens are genuinely so angry with the present system and hate the Democrats so much that they would vote for somebody like Trump. But the second thing is, of course, that the reason why 3 out of the last 5 US presidential elections have been won by the Republicans with a clear minority of the popular vote is nothing to do with Russia. It's to do with the crazy 18th century provisions of the US Constitution. But of course, the US Constitution is sacred, can't criticize it. And secondly, even if you do criticize it, you can't change it because the constitutional requirements for changing the Constitution are impossible in present circumstances. So how much better, of course, to say that in the end, or to believe that none of this is really to do with America at all. It's all to do with Putin, Putin's manipulation. Which is frankly an absurdity, but when people cannot look the truth in the face, they look for lies instead.
That's what scares me a lot, that the internal failings of Western democracies, the United States, but also in Europe, we have enough of them as well, do lead to externalizing all of this pain and pointing the finger at two enemies, Russia and China. And both of this is highly dangerous, right? Which leads me to the question of how to then to stabilize, or at least to diffuse, the trigger points that could become these new Sarajevos. In the Pacific, it is clearly Taiwan that could trigger something absolutely horrible. And in Europe at the moment, I mean, Ukraine and Georgia are flashpoints. So, which leads me to the next point. I mean, I have this neutrality network, and it is kind of a no-brainer for people like me who study neutrality that this would be, Ukraine is the perfect example of a state and a situation that you could get back rolling if you just decided to do what we already did for 200 years to other points, like my home country, Switzerland, like Austria, just neutralize it and federalize. Now, what do you see stands in, what speaks for a neutral Ukraine? And Macron actually kind of recognized that now, talking about the Finlandization, which in my view is the wrong term, absolutely the wrong term. But we'll talk about that. And the other thing is, like, do you think it can happen, or do you see the political stars not aligning?
I mean, I strongly support this myself. I have, written again and again in support of neutrality. That was the line in my book of 1999. And by the way, once again, I've criticized Russia very strongly for its behavior, not just the West. I don't think that that is possible today because our governments, led of course by the United States, have so boxed themselves in by their rhetoric that I didn't think they can do that. I think it is still just possible that they might accept a moratorium on Ukrainian NATO membership, which, by the way, sacrifices nothing, since, as you said, Ukraine is not going to get into NATO anyway. So, why not, just say, look, this is delayed by 20 years while we try to sort out, all the problems surrounding it. And of course, entirely, there's a logical case there. Ukraine cannot join NATO as long as it has a war going on with Russian, backed separatists in the Donbass. So let us set out to shelve this, to solve that war, to solve the political problems there and elsewhere with Russia, and then revisit this issue in 20 years' time. Now, the thing is, though, that my most recent book actually was on climate change in the nation state, which came out last year. And I'm pretty convinced that by 20 years from now, certainly if you read all the predictions by 30 years from now, the effects of climate change will have become so bad already. Not so much the direct physical effects on the West, but the effects on weaker and more endangered societies in West Africa, for example. That all these problems with Russia, and perhaps even with China as well, will begin to assume their real perspective, their real importance in historical terms, which is minor.
So that was a technical problem in the communication here. But I think it's a good opportunity to actually wrap up also the interview. And I would like to ask you, Anatol, we've seen in the past these neutrality movements inside Ukraine that did exist in the 1990s and up until 2014, depending on which government was in power. And then, well, under Petro Poroshenko, that was reversed. But Mr. Zelensky is kind of, or was at least portrayed as an outsider, as a comedian coming in. And there have been ideas, for example, by Steve Wald, that all that's needed at the moment to unblock the situation is to sell the Ukrainians and the current Ukrainian government that they themselves should declare neutrality, and then you get the process starting. And actually, the Russians in their two draft treaties, they didn't actually use the word neutrality. They described it but they didn't name it. So do you see any way forward to actually work with Ukraine in basically opting themselves for a neutral solution?
Well, I think that a majority of Ukrainians would probably go with that. It's worth noting that both Poroshenko and Zelensky were elected on platforms of seeking relaxation of tension with Russia, some kind of compromise with Russia. And I think also that with time, as it becomes evident to Ukrainians that there is in fact no chance of getting into NATO, more and more Ukrainians will come round to the idea. Also, of course, this would return agency to the hands of the Ukrainians, because, of course, this would be, as you say, a Ukrainian declaration. So Ukraine would cease to be what it really is at the moment, which is a plaything of, East-West geopolitical confrontation. The problem is, though, that as both Poroshenko and Zelensky discovered, they are in permanent danger of being overthrown by radical nationalists who control a large part of the armed forces, and also, as they demonstrated in 2014, have tremendous street power. And I fear that this is also one reason why the West has not put pressure on Ukraine, actually to implement the Minsk peace agreement, for fear that you would have the overthrow of the Ukrainian government by right-wing forces. Now, of course, if that happened, it would, that would play completely into Russia's hands, because Ukraine would be totally isolated at that point. But I would hope that sensible European governments might actually say this to the Ukrainians. Unfortunately, of course, you have a German government where, the foreign minister exemplifies, what Max Weber called Gesinnungsethik, a pretend, ethical policy with, of course, no willingness whatsoever to fight for Ukraine, but entirely, based on declarative ethics. And France, as I said, is highly dependent on the United States in West Africa. So, as we have seen for the previous 7 years and more, or in fact going all the way back to 2007, when the idea of NATO membership for Ukraine first came up, French governments have been, willing to push back a bit against the more aggressive American policies, but they've never been willing to follow through. I mean, as I have written, Macron could bring this entire crisis to an end with 4 words: j'ai dit non. Just to say, no, France does not think we have any chance of ever defending Ukraine, and therefore I declare on behalf of France that we hereby veto Ukrainian NATO membership and will continue to do so. I think that would be enough to end this present crisis. It wouldn't end, of course, the deeper issues. But somebody in Europe has to actually think about European security instead of constantly running back, under the wings of the United States, which I am less and less convinced gives a damn about European security. It gives a damn about American power. Well, you could say that's what an American government should do. But if America is going to think about, American global domination, Europe has to think about European security. My fear is that we are simply incapable as a continent of doing so.
Very last question. What do you think will the impact of the current crisis be on other developments, especially China?
Well, as I've often said, a great deal of US policy over the past 20 years in the Middle East, but in Europe as well, might have been designed in Beijing, because of the extent to which it actually serves China's interests. Above all, of course, if Europe does cut itself off from Russian gas as a result of sanctions, that will tremendously strengthen China's energy security, because it will then be able to get all its energy overland from Russia instead of by sea from the Middle East, along routes which America can interdict in the event of war. Yeah. So it will certainly strengthen China. I mean, my other fear, though, is that especially with the emphasis being thrown back on energy security, that this is going to be a very severe blow to action against climate change. We've already seen the multiple failures of European action against climate change. And now all the talk in America is how, we've got to forget about, green energy and action to reduce climate change, because the only thing that matters is energy security against Russia. So I fear that this will be a bad blow to climate change, for which I think our descendants 100 years from now will not forgive us. I mean, think about a historian 100 years from now, looking back and saying, everybody in the West acknowledged that Ukraine couldn't be a member of NATO, and yet they insist on keeping open the possibility, the principle of Ukraine being a member of NATO. And this led to a huge international crisis in which, for months on end, climate change was completely forgotten. I mean, were these people crazy? I think they will look on us as we look on our ancestors before 1914, and ask, how can they have been so utterly stupid?
Nearly all European conflicts of the last couple of hundred years were utterly dumb if you look at the big picture, and I think this one is just another one. I would hope we can diffuse it.
I suppose at the heart of realist thinking is ultimately the idea that man is a fallen being and human perfection is not to be looked for. As a historian, I keep hoping that we will learn from history, and I keep being disappointed.
Yeah, but looking at history, it's also unlikely that we'll do so, because we're pretty bad at it. We're resilient to learning. Anyhow, Anatol, thank you very much for agreeing to this interview, for giving us your insights. I hope to talk to you soon again.
And we will go on working for neutrality.
Let's do it.
Thank you so much.
And have a good evening. Bye.
Bye-bye.